Almost 7 years ago, I wrote a book with a former Baltimore homicide detective called Why Do We Kill? In it, we recounted a Baltimore police department that was seemingly infused by corruption, but it turns out we were wrong in light of recent scandals. The agency is in fact defined by it. A damning report for the Department of Justice, a consent decree ballooning overtime costs, and seemingly the most disturbing development, a burgeoning scandal involving at least 8 officers of the Gun Trace Task Force who are accused of stealing money from residents, dealing drugs, and racketeering. And now with the killing of Detective Sean Suiter, who we recently learned was set to testify in the case, things have gone from bad to worse, as Baltimore Police Commissioner Kevin Davis just asked the FBI to take the case. But amid all the obvious dysfunction, not a single police officer has been fired, and the city and charitable organizations keep giving the department money. More, not less. So what's going on? And is there a path forward to fix this? And is this department beyond repair? To help me answer this question are 3 of the best journalists in town, with too many awards to mention. Jayne Miller is an investigative journalist with WBAL-TV. Luke Broadwater works for the Baltimore Sun and covers City Hall. And Taya Graham is a real news reporter and member of the infamous Mod Squad. Thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate it. But before we get started, we have a package from Taya to give us an update on where we are in the death of Detective Sean Suiter.
It's a vacant lot surrounded by abandoned homes. And yet this desolate patch of dirt symbolizes both the conflicts and secrets that continue to roil Baltimore. It's here where Detective Sean Suiter was found shot in the head by his own gun 3 weeks ago. At first, police blamed the community.
I do understand the temporary inconvenience for residents. I've personally interacted with residents in Harlem Park myself, and to a person, each and every one of them understands why we're out there and why we're doing what we need to do. They don't want a killer roaming around their community.
But since then, doubts, and now a call for the FBI to intervene.
And so this individual was preparing to testify before the grand jury the following day. And so the FBI is already in this case. In fact, the FBI has been engaged for some time. But we really wanted them to take a close look at this particular killing or shooting, whatever took place.
That's because Suiter was shot the day before he was set to testify in front of a grand jury in a major police corruption case. Suiter, a homicide detective, was a witness in a 2010 drug case involving Sergeant Wayne Jenkins, one of now 9 officers indicted for drug dealing, stealing cash from residents, and racketeering. Suiter was involved in the alleged drug bust, which led to a high-speed chase and an accident that killed the father of a Baltimore police officer. A case that federal prosecutors say was built upon planted drugs placed in the defendant's car after the accident. It's a critical link between the actions of the former members of the Drug Trace Task Force caught on wiretaps in 2016 and the past. A case that could have broad implications for the department, suggesting corruption is both widespread and endemic. But more importantly, say the activists, it's case in point for why civilian control of police is not only important, but necessary.
We feel like it's come to a head. They have to be disbanded, and the community has to take community control of police. That is one thing that we feel strongly about.
So Jayne, let's just start with the death of Detective Suiter.
Correct.
Which has been, obviously very controversial. What do we know now?
It'll be 3 weeks tomorrow.
It'll be 3 weeks.
Right?
So
Yes,
where are we with the case?
November 15th, correct.
You asked a very provocative question about self-inflicted at the press conference, and the commissioner pushed back. But where are we with this case? What do we know, if anything, about what happened to him?
Well, at this moment, it'll be 3 weeks tomorrow. We know that the police department has now publicly acknowledged that there are competing theories in the case. Mm-hmm. One is homicide, and the other is suicide. And that's kind of where we are. There's been very little activity related to this tip line and $250,000 reward.
Very few leads.
Correct. Very few public leads that have publicly come in. And so there's a bit of a feeling about this case that's kind of cold.
Yeah.
And now that can change at any moment. But I do know that, and the reason I asked the question on Friday publicly, to really publicly acknowledge this, is because I do know that from the very moment that this happened, there was evidence and features of this event. Gunshot wound to the head, close range, gun right there.
No real forensic evidence from a struggle.
No, and now we know there was no fingerprint, DNA, et cetera,
Right.
to indicate a second person on the gun. Now, that's not conclusive on its own.
course,
There could be a lot
of
of
course.
reasons for that. There was initially this vague description offered by the police department of a person in a black jacket, white stripes, and
Right.
we haven't heard that in a while.
No.
The area where it happened, which now I have a very good sense of, is one of the most secluded areas, considering it's in the heart of a densely populated urban area.
Yeah.
Just kind of perfect. Very few windows to see into it, surrounded by walls that don't have windows in them,
Right.
vacant houses that may have a view, but they're vacant, and no cameras. I mean, it's amazing. One of the most violent blocks in Baltimore is the 900 block of Bennett Place, where this happened, and there's not a City Watch camera within a half mile.
So it'd be a perfect place to, say, assassinate someone or for someone to commit
It's
suicide.
a perfect
or you
place
just don't
to
want to
pick
kill someone.
that if you really want to get out of there undetected, or you want whatever is happening, you want it to go undetected.
So, Luke, with all this, a profound announcement by the police commissioner saying, hey, I can't handle this case, or we can't as a police department, we want the FBI to intervene. But what was really striking to me is that over at City Hall, everyone was like sort of joining the commissioner in this request. What did you get the sense, what was it that tipped the politicians, like City Council President Jack Young and Brandon Scott and people, and even the mayor? What was your sense, because you covered City Hall for a while, that suddenly they were ready to throw in the towel and say, let's get the FBI involved in this?
Yeah, well, I think they're responding to what the community wants. There's a lot of distrust right now in whether this police department can investigate this crime. Once the news came out that the Detective Suter was about to testify before a grand jury into the corruption case against 8 members of the gun trace task force. That raised a lot of questions, raised a lot of suspicion. People lost confidence in the ability of the police department to fairly investigate this case. You put that in combination with the lockdown of Harlem Park for multiple days, agitating many in the community. And I think the politicians, the city council, even the mayor and the police commissioner themselves had to acknowledge that it would be better if an outside entity like the FBI took the lead on this investigation.
Interesting. I'll tell you, you saw firsthand the response from the community, because you attended a Civilian Review Board meeting, which was in the community in Harlem Park. What did you see?
Well, the Civilian Review Board is 9 residents who are tasked with looking at complaints from the community, from discourtesy to brutality. We're in a small church in Harlem Park, and members from the community came forward to talk about their concerns and their frustration. The entire community had been cordoned off. People talked about their mail being interrupted. Some people were unable to get to work and lost wages. There was even a claim of false imprisonment. People had to show their IDs. People were made to sit on the ground and be frisked. So the community was very upset.
We got to go after the people who gave the orders, because the police officers on the front line just don't decide to quadrant off a city and be assigned to one area. They don't make those decisions. This came from the police commissioner, and that's what we have to start.
And as the ACLU was there, Delegate Carter, who was there, who oversees the Civilian Review Board, and it seemed like there wasn't anything they could do to reassure the community that they could trust the police department.
Yeah, there
again.
was some profound expression of long-term discontent with the police department that I saw there.
Which is interesting.
Yeah.
That
Go
all
ahead.
these years of talking about police reform and
Well,
everything
yeah.
else, and we still have that level of
Palpable.
And one of the points that I've made is that you have to think this through. These are the communities that, in the corruption case, these are the same communities that the officers accused in the corruption case are accused of robbing, lying, stealing, threatening, et cetera.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And now you've got this death of a homicide detective in West Baltimore, and you're going back to the same well, so to speak, and expecting people to cooperate with you when there's a lot of bad feeling
Right.
towards the police department in these communities.
Talk a little bit, what's interesting is how the scope has expanded, because, originally it was 2016, they had wiretaps, but now talk a little about this 2010 case, because this 2010 case takes the timeline for this
Really
scandal
stretches it.
and stretches it 7 years, right?
Right. So what happened in 2010 is that there was a traffic stop, allegedly, involving Wayne Jenkins, who's one of the indicted officers,
Right.
involving Sean Suter, who was a plainclothes detective at that time working with this crew, and another officer. And the three of them got involved in this car stop. And Suter, this is according to Jenkins, okay?
Right.
Jenkins wrote the charging document. Charging document says that Suter was in the back, the other two, Jenkins and the other officer, were in the front, kind of boxing him in. They didn't want to cooperate. And the reason they stopped them, Jenkins wrote, is because they saw a guy getting into the car with cash. So they thought it's a drug transaction. I mean, this is Baltimore, so,
Right.
you know, you don't need a whole lot more that
Obviously
has been
not.
used for, you know, thousands of times by police as probable cause.
Right.
And so the other officer drew a gun on the driver and then took off. Car took off. Went about, I don't know, some distance, and there was a pursuit, and the driver of that car ran into another vehicle, crashed into a vehicle at an intersection, and the 87-year-old man that was in that car died.
Who was a father of police,
Correct,
Baltimore police
that's
officer,
right. So at the time, nothing happened. Nothing happened involving the police. The driver of the car and his passenger were both charged. The driver of the car pleaded guilty to manslaughter. They both were prosecuted in federal court on drug charges, and there was a guilty plea from the driver of the car in that case too. Fast forward, Jenkins gets indicted in March, indictment's unsealed. The defendant in that case, whose name is Mr. Burley, writes a letter to the judge in his case and says, hey, I need a lawyer because this is the guy who arrested me, Wayne Jenkins, and someone needs to look at my case. Well, apparently they did, because in August, he was released from prison after serving less than half of his prison time. The prosecutors now want to vacate the conviction in the drug case, and Jenkins has now had new charges added to him, accusing him of planting drugs. And the role of Sean Suter in that case is that, again, this is according to the new charges. Right. He's the one who recovered the planted drugs without knowing they were planted.
Oh. Well, look, one of the really fascinating details from that case is that a sergeant just shows up with, 47 Joe Cops. But you cover policing a lot. I mean, what does that tell you about the level and the depth of, potential corruption in the police department? I don't want to put you on the spot if you're uncomfortable with that, but that was, to me, that was like, wow. Do they have a FedEx system where they're, they're delivering? Who needs drugs? Who needs drugs planted? Call this guy. He shows up because he got there on the scene pretty quickly because there was an accident. So, if you're basically covering police corruption, what do you think?
Well, I think that the corruption scandal involving the Gun Trace Task Force is certainly the biggest and deepest corruption scandal that I've seen in my time covering Baltimore, maybe ever. The fact that the agency was very heavily reliant on these 8 men to basically get a disproportionate amount of guns off the case, and was lauding them and
they're lauding them. We used to get their emails,
promoting them and pumping
gun
them
offender.
up.
I remember it was constant.
So I think that given that scenario, many people have said there was kind of a blind eye turned to some of the things they were doing. And now we know the depth of this case, and with 5 of them pleading guilty, they're admitting it themselves. So this isn't me calling them guilty; they're even admitting. Do
you think there's any recognition in the city council and the city hall how deep this goes? I mean, honestly, do people talk to you about it, or is it just hey, there's always a little bit of scandal in the police department. This is nothing abnormal.
Well, I mean, we've grown accustomed to a little bit of scandal with the police department.
That's true.
We've had towing scandals. We've had flex squad scandals.
Right, and you wrote about Gemini Jones, one of the best articles on policing anyone should read. I don't know if you can get it online, but Gemini Jones was part of the flex squad who just basically boasted to you about all the unconstitutional tactics, right?
Right, and what as we all know, what the DOJ said is in the push to ramp up arrests back in 1999, in which arrests started to go over 100,000, a culture was ingrained in the police department and was passed down from the top to mid-level to the low level, in which constitutional rights were violated. That's what the Department of Justice said.
And now your article about Pugh, where you're saying Pugh's first year is consumed by violence, but she's kind of wedded to the police department again, like other mayors, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Can I just add that the gun trace task force, because of the gun trace task force, prosecutors are going to drop or have already dropped about 125 cases. Right. If the city state's attorney's office has to review the cases starting since 2010, they could be looking at what, almost 2,000 cases.
That's what the public defender's office said. Yeah, 2,000 cases.
So that's an incredible number. If you add that to the body camera footage cases where there's police officers and, depending on your point of view, are either planting evidence or reenacting the placement of drugs, this is an incredible amount of cases to have to review. And you cannot forget the real impact here. Even though the scandal and the depth of the scandal is impressive, we have to remember how many people are sitting in jail falsely accused who've lost years of their lives because of the gun trace task force and these other crooked cops.
Just the kind of the history of the last 40 years. I did a story not too long ago on the war on drugs in Baltimore. Drug arrests have dominated policing.
Absolutely.
In cities like Baltimore. The number of people arrested between 1980 and 2014 on drug charges in the city of Baltimore is more than 630,000.
That's incredible. The entire
I'm sorry,
city.
that's not the number of people. That's the number of arrests. Some of those people were arrested more than once. But it's an enormous number of arrests.
That's the population of Baltimore.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
And so year after year after year after year, there were people being arrested on drug charges. And it became the barometer of how well the police department was doing. It's how many people they were locking up on drug charges.
And at one point, and I want you to continue this, it changes the culture of policing. You don't have to arrest someone for committing a specific act with intent.
No, correct.
You just got to find something on them.
Correct. Just chase them around, get a few bags.
If this is a thing and I put it next to Luke, I can arrest Luke. If I want to prove that Luke committed a burglary, I got to do some work. But I can just pull over a car. It makes fishing almost like the most beneficial.
And it continues today. I mean, that's still very much a priority in policing in Baltimore, is chasing people around.
The body cam.
Right, that's what it shows. Right, correct.
Yeah.
So this idea that, it's hard to swallow, to think that officers, all the time they were arresting these folks, that some of them were doing it in a corrupt manner. It's a lot to wrap your head around about the depth of the dishonesty of what may have been going on for all these years. And yes, now we see that all those officers involved in that 2010 incident are going to have to be looked at.
Yeah.
Because Souter's gone, but there's Jenkins was already indicted. There's two other sergeants.
There's a sergeant looming out there who we don't, they've been
they've suspended one.
Right, and then there's another guy. But
and he obviously is the witness. I mean, the new information in this indictment against Jenkins can only come from one person. It can only come from one person.
Right.
Because Souter's dead. Jenkins is not talking, right?
So it's got to be that sergeant.
It's that one sergeant. Yeah, that's correct. The one who's now been suspended. Right. So now, what's the impact?
How far does it go? Well, how far does it go?
Think about the impact.
How deep does it go? Yeah, sure.
But the impact is, here you are with the FBI. The FBI is conducting this obviously ongoing investigation. And now one of your witnesses is dead, and another one is suspended.
Right.
And it's like, what's the impact of that?
Well, let me throw this out there. Is it possible that this scandal only is limited to 10 or 12?
Well, no, I think that's everybody's concern, is that how far does it go?
Because
and keep in mind how it started. Okay, this all started, they got lucky on a drug wiretap.
Right, they weren't looking for it.
No, that's correct. That's an interesting question. They weren't looking for it.
No, they were not.
So you've had complaint after complaint after complaint all these years. People saying, I got ripped off, I got strip searched, and da-da-da-da-da. And it takes almost an accidental listening to a wiretap focused on drug dealers to hear this cop show up on it. And that started the much broader, the much more focused investigation than on particular officers.
Well, Luke, I was thinking about, I want to return a little bit to Pew, but I also want to throw out there, Commissioner Davis dropped something in the press conference that no one had heard before, which is this broken boundaries concept.
Exactly.
Like what? So
he leaked the name. That's
I know. I was
incredible.
He was saying he was not a part of the broken boundaries. Like, what is broken boundaries?
Yeah, right. Where's that?
So,
right.
I mean, is there a feeling over at City Hall that Commissioner Davis can't be trusted? Or, I mean, the point is that it's almost like the police department is trying to sabotage this case to a certain extent. I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot
Sure,
here, but
well, I think Pugh trusts Commissioner Davis a lot.
right? Does she want to get rid of him, or what do you think?
I don't think so.
Okay.
In every conversation I've had with her about Davis, she's very committed to him. She thinks he's doing the right things, and that crime eventually will fall, and he's a reformer of the police department. That said, some of his statements in the past week have been inconsistent. I mean, at first he said that it seemed that he had just learned about this new information about Souter being a federal witness, and then he said, well, actually, I learned about it 3 or 4 days before that.
Right.
Right. There have been other things
well,
like
also,
that.
you know, he kind of immediately touted this idea that there was some killer who lived in the city lurking in Harlem Park,
Right.
and that we were going to lock down Harlem Park, soulless, heartless, assault on democracy.
Right.
Now,
Assault on American policing. Right.
now,
correct.
what do you do if you've gone publicly and said that, and suddenly your detective's saying, well, you know, this could have been self-inflicted, or he's a witness in a federal case? You would think Davis would have the political acumen to keep his mouth shut, but apparently he doesn't. I mean, and yet you think Pugh has no sort of misgivings about him or anyone on the council.
But I think that I get this feeling, this sense that people in the city council and now in the mayor, et cetera, think that, oh, well, if the FBI takes it, everything gets cleaned up with this.
But there's a lot of intertanglements between the FBI
and I think you're asking a lot for people to say, oh, well, it's the FBI, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, you're putting an agency, the FBI, in kind of a very bad situation.
Right. Sure.
2 weeks
Clean up
after
my
the
mess.
fact, you want them to come in and now lead this investigation, and while you make the request, you accuse them, publicly accuse them of leaving your detectives in the dark.
He said in the press conference, well, I didn't know about this, and what else don't I know? And so I'm giving it to the FBI because I don't know. And he's basically saying, you know what, the FBI doesn't trust me, so I'm just going to divulge information about their investigation. I mean, a lot of homicide detectives I talked to said he should never have mentioned the fact that Souter was a witness in this grand jury indictment.
There's a lot of debate about that. I mean, there was something that was not unknown, but I mean, it was like, who was going to report it?
Yeah.
Right. Well, Luke, what were you going to say?
I actually think his hand was forced by the media in that case. I think
okay.
that several outlets were all on to this
We knew that
information.
that Souter had worked with these guys
Right.
a lot,
Right.
and
so
yes,
we were
correct.
getting close to reporting. The police department knew
Right.
we were getting close to reporting. So I think they thought it was better to come out and get in front of this story and be proactive about this information.
But then for a police commissioner to say, well, you know, I don't know what's going on, and basically telegraph that the feds don't trust him. I mean, you know, Taya, this is sort of a history in Baltimore of police commissioners and police agencies getting intertwined with the mayor in a way that almost compromises them, right?
Right. I mean, Mayor Pugh is in a bad position, and perhaps that's why she's forced to trust Commissioner Davis. Whenever a mayor weds themselves to reducing crime in Baltimore, they rise and fall with the success of the police department, which means that it's to their benefit to turn the other way when the police department does brutal actions to try to get crime under control. We saw that in 1999 when Martin O'Malley promised to reduce violent crime in Baltimore City. He enacted zero tolerance, which we know from the Department of Justice report, from reports from the community,
whole game, basically.
That it created the plainclothes units along the lines of the Gun Trace Task Force, which we know used brutal and unconstitutional and even racist policing practices. Later, in 2014, our Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake comes forward and says, well, policing's an ugly business. It's not all peaches and cream. So the community has to
I'll never forget that.
what it gets.
She did say that. She said policing
if you want to be safe, you're just going to have to take it. You get what you get what you
it's
deserve.
Interesting rhetoric. You know, if you were running like a hustle or a competence game, I mean, we were talking just before we started about this donation from Bloomberg. It seems that no matter how bad the police department performs, people still throw money at them. So really, it's like a perverse incentive. You've seen this, Jayne, over years, and Luke wrote some great pieces about it. We'll start with you. You know, they just get more money no matter what they do, no matter how bad they perform, no matter, I mean, if we as journalists had a Just Smart report about us, about being this bad, and I've probably said this before, we'd all be fired. But these guys, the Bloomberg just said, let's give them more money. I mean, what's going on?
Their budget has been an ever-escalating number, dramatically so.
No matter what happens,
outpaces everything else in terms of your spending priorities. And I think it probably sends a very disheartening message to. I think this Bloomberg grant is called an innovation grant. Am I correct? You guys wrote about this, right?
It's a Bloomberg Philanthropies grant.
Okay,
yeah.
all right, and it's going to the police department.
Right.
It's we have children that are desperate for pre-K. We have children who are desperate for after school. They call it enrichment, and the money just. What's the one thing that's happened in the western part of Baltimore in the last couple of years is that the Western District Police Station got renovated with private foundation money.
And I mean, Luke, you had a really interesting tweet where you showed the police spending over about, 5 or 6 years, when you said it went from like 150, it went up 150 million, almost the same amount as the school deficit.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
it was like, what was it like? You went to like
it had risen by about 130 million a year, I think, since 2007, if I recall. Which was at the time the size of the school deficit. So you could see how the budget really has grown dramatically. And I think actually Bill Henry had a recent op-ed about this.
Yes, he
where
did.
He put that the recreation and parks funding had pretty much stayed the same over his tenure in government. But the police department budget had risen by, I think, 4 or 5 times.
How do you have a functional agency where the incentives fail? The more you fail and the more the worse the city gets that you're working in, the more money you get. I mean, what's Pew estimating, like $10 million a year for I'm speaking out of turn, but for the consent decree spending, I think it's like
we
know 1.7 something for the monitor. We know that.
Right.
And then on top of that, it was 10, 12, 10?
That sounds right, but
I don't know if that's an annual amount. I think there's an upfront amount.
We don't know exactly, but the point is that if you look at consent decree spending, it's hundreds of millions of dollars. So the point is, heads I win, tails
Well, and
you lose.
I think the other problem right now is that consent decree is just getting drowned out by the corruption allegations.
Right.
I mean, there's no question that it's like, okay, these guys were doing this while the DOJ was in your backyard.
Right. It just shows how incredibly brazen they
right.
are.
I mean, that's the truth.
And we think 2010 at least, and I think, the guy like when you wrote that Gemini Jones piece, a lot of stuff he does was at least unconstitutional. I don't know if he was planning drugs or anything, but that Flex Squad was raided.
Yeah.
And they found like gambling dice and money and drugs and everything. And it was controversial.
And one of the allegations in that case was that the same charging documents were being used for multiple people, and they were just changing out the individuals' names.
It's like a boilerplate.
Yeah.
And just so people know, that was 2006, right? Or was it
that sounds about right.
Yeah.
That was also the allegation in that Special Enforcement Unit, which wasn't Gemini Jones. It was another group that
So
they were just cutting and pasting. But again, it gets back to the drug enforcement.
Right.
And we're talking 10 years, and I'm telling you reviewed a lot of those zero tolerance, and they are very similar, right?
Oh, absolutely. Well, the zero tolerance cases in particular really illustrate the heart of zero tolerance policing, how broken windows theory really works. I looked at about 100 reports from 2006, and it said expectorating on sidewalk, having an open container of Steel Reserve beer, purchasing loose cigarettes, or being in the neighborhood and not being able to produce ID to prove that you live there would mean that you would be arrested and taken down to central booking.
That is a profound power, to be able to say, I was just driving there, I saw a person, I'm going to take them into custody. But that went on, and no one politically, until the Justice Department and Freddie Gray happened, was really willing to criticize it. So I guess the question is, and I'll go across as a final question, is like, is there anything to do at this point other than follow this? Maybe this corruption will be the answer, that we follow this corruption case to its end. But what can be done? I mean, is there any political will?
I think Baltimore is in a really delicate position right now. There's not a lot of confidence in leadership. The violence continues, as it has for all these years. I know everybody's, look, we only had 197 homicides in 2011.
Well, there was a blizzard.
But it's like, what?
There was like 4 weeks of snow where people couldn't walk.
That's
outside.
right. The very same communities that have been so plagued by violence are still the same communities all plagued by the violence. Right. That's what has not changed. You can say, it was more numbers then, and it doesn't matter. These are communities that are completely under siege and have been. Decade after decade, that's correct.
Yes.
And now, I think the biggest difference now versus the 90s is that these communities that are so plagued by violence are all the more hollowed out.
Yeah.
And then they've lost investment, they've lost people, they've lost business, they've lost everything, and they're just a skeleton now of what they were 20 and 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And they are still under siege with violence. So I just think we're in a really delicate place that somebody or something has to emerge that restores some confidence in leadership. And I don't know what that is at this point.
Well, Luke, you've written about competing crime plans.
Sure.
Has anybody emerged other than the mayor? Anything come out of city council that seems like it might be headed in a different direction?
Well, so I'll address two things. One, police corruption, and then two, crime.
Sure.
I spoke with both the city solicitor, Andre Davis, and Joe Carter, the head of the Office of Civil Rights, about tackling police corruption. And both of them believe that the culture needs to change so that there's a great pride in constitutional policing, that police officers become experts in the law, that they have a great a sense of mission in terms of policing according to the Constitution, not the past standards of policing by the number of arrests or whatever other metrics they were using. And that you really need to change the entire culture of the agency to achieve that goal. The other point about crime is I think Mayor Pugh needs to decide whether she wants to pursue the conservative solutions to crime or the liberal solutions to crime. And conservatives traditionally has been longer sentences, more police, more arrests, all about enforcement. Whereas she started off her tenure talking about preventing crime by investing in youth,
That she definitely did.
Increasing wages, eliminating poverty, things like that, which would prevent crime, not just punish it. There is also a hybrid way, which is funding things like Safe Streets and
Pure
Operation Ceasefire, which do both things, which give ex-offenders jobs and have them intervene in the community without arrests. But you really need to fund these things.
True.
Give people real options for job training and jobs once you've identified who are the people that need the most attention.
And you have to be consistent about it.
Yeah.
Those cure violence efforts have never gotten consistent funding.
Well, they've never
in the
been funded by
Baltimore.
City Hall. They're always funded by grants. Taya, I'll give you the last word. What do you think might be happening or developing in terms of real reform?
Well, if we're looking for a way forward, I think we need to look at the next state legislative session in Annapolis, where most likely Mayor Pugh and activists will once again try to get a civilian placed on the Internal Disciplinary Trial Board. The FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police, the union, effectively fought against that last year.
Very effectively.
So, and this form of civilian oversight is actually very relevant, very important, because we just saw the trial boards of Lieutenant Brian Rice and Caesar Goodson, who were both officers involved with the in-custody death of Freddie Gray. They escaped any sort of criminal discipline, and then through that trial board, they also escaped any sort of administrative discipline. So if we're looking for a way forward, the question is, will the FOP fight us every step of the way?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously we all know, I think, that as long as the police department continues to have most of the budget, most of the money, most of the power, most of the rhetorical power, I don't know what we do. But I really appreciate everybody coming here. And
It was really encouraging.
Sorry.
Very positive note to end on. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, you were right, though.
Well, they do. They get all the money.
They got the biggest bullhorn, and they got all the money.
They got all
yes,
the money.
correct. That's right.
Maybe we're on the wrong team.
Yeah, and they love the camera now. So anyway, listen, thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate it. We'll continue this discussion. This is Stephen Janis reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore. Thank you for joining us.